Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very warm welcome once more to the European Humanitarian Forum. This high-level session is titled Climate Change, Disaster and Displacement, Time for a Comprehensive Approach. I'm very happy to see that you are joining us here at the Brussels Fine Arts Museum. There's, I guess, about 70 people, maybe up to 100 in the room, and we're joined by many people online as well. I welcome all of you on behalf of the French Presidency of the Council of the European Union, as well as European Commission DG ECHO. A quick list of technical notes before we move on. French and English interpretation is available. To switch your language, if you are joining us online, you need to look for the headphones icon. And if you are a remote speaker, then you need the globe icon to switch the language. The event is recorded and will be available at the EHF website. In fact, publicly available. Some technical notes for those joining us as remote speakers. If possible, we kindly invite you to switch on your camera, but please do switch off your microphone unless you are speaking. Also, my last request, rename yourself. Mention your country and organization first, followed by your name and title. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Ali El Jabri. I'm a professional moderator and presenter with Pro Moderation. I'm a former Europe correspondent for Associated Press TV, and I have some experience in the humanitarian field. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to learning from your input. So how does the program of this session look like? We'll have a number of keynotes to start with, then we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll take some interventions from the floor, and we'll conclude with some brief time for interaction. To interact, we'll be using the Slido interaction tool. If I'm not mistaken, you should be able to see the Slido event code on the screen now, and if not, then I ask the IT department kindly to screen that. Meanwhile, you can just visit sli.do. So if you're in the room and you cannot scan the QR code, visit sli.do, S-L-I.do, and enter hashtag EHF-AB. You'll be able to send us your comments and questions at any time, and we'll try to entertain as much of your input as possible at the end of the session. We really do look forward to your input, as I'm sure we'll all be able to learn from that. Before I invite the keynote speakers to the floor, let me set the scene of this session. Millions of people are internally displaced as a result of environmental disaster and climate change. The European Commission is concerned and highly involved in this matter, in particular through humanitarian and development efforts. This panel brings together EU institutions and key stakeholders to discuss joint efforts before, during, and after climate-related displacement. I'm sure our discussions will help the EU further develop its approach, among others as the incoming chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. And now, without further ado, it's time to listen to the keynotes, of which we will have 3. And the keynote speakers were kind enough to promise to stick to the time limit of 7 minutes. Our first speaker, and I'd like to invite him to come forward, is the Director General of the International Organization for Migration, Mr. Antonio Vitorino. Shall we energize the welcome with an applause? Enjoy.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to all of you. Let me take my watch out so that the moderator does not get too stressed. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me for this session. We meet today in a difficult time where I'm sure all our thoughts are directed to the war in Ukraine. And therefore, I would like to take this opportunity to add my voice to, I'm sure, all your voices to call for the immediate cessation of hostilities, and also to praise the generosity of the peoples of the neighboring countries, their governments, showing that when there is generosity and solidarity, we can work together and make a difference. And I hope that this reminder will also apply to the subject of our session today. We are witnessing a global climate crisis, which will impact every society. I do even believe, as my grandmother used to say, that sometimes the weather has manifestations that happen once in a generation. Well, I'm afraid my grandmother was wrong. Nowadays, we are witnessing with relentless frequency extreme weather manifestations that occur recurrently. And of course, the consequences will be particularly severe for communities that are most susceptible to environmental and also human impacts. Small islands, definitely. Low-lying coastal areas, mountain areas, and climate events that were in arid zones, those usually taking place in least developed countries, without forgetting the ones that are occurring also each time more and more in Europe and in the Americas. The recent IPCC report estimates that over 3.3 billion people, yes, this is the figure, 3.3 billion people live in contexts that are highly exposed to the impacts of climate change. And my point of view as Director General of IOM is to underline that climate crisis has a profound impact on human mobility. We foresee growing numbers of people displaced, many forced to abandon their homes forever, while others will have little choice but to remain in increasingly dangerous and fragile places. That's why I believe that every occasion we have to call the attention about the human face of climate change is extremely important. This year we will have 3 of them. The International Migration Review Forum that is coming up in New York in May, that will take stock of the implementation of the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. Secondly, COP27, definitely. And last but not least, the midterm review of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. What does this mean? This means that I do believe that we have already solid platforms. And we have, of course, a good understanding of the complexity of the impacts of climate change in human mobility. So what are we lacking? What are we missing? I think 2 things. First, improve our capacity of foresight, of anticipatory action, of looking ahead and saying, where are the fragilities? Where do we need to act to prevent and mitigate the impacts of climate change? And the second thing that we need to recognize is that there is a long way to build capacity, to empower the communities, to strengthen their resilience so that they can cope with climate change. This will have to be declined in 3 main elements. First, the policies on human mobility need to be an integral part of how we assist and protect those that are displaced because of climate change. Assist and protect. Secondly, climate change, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction needs planning, strategies, and funding. And when I come to this point, everybody says, okay, a UN agency asking for funding. That's usual. Well, but in this case, it is absolutely necessary to recognize that the funding allocations in general for climate change are below the commitments, but even more than that. For adaptation, they are even lower than what is absolutely needed. And third and last element, this is not just an humanitarian issue. This is each time more and more a development issue. And you cannot look to the impact of human mobility just from the perspective of assistance. You need also to look at it from the perspective of creating durable solutions for the people that are impacted by climate change. That's why it is absolutely necessary to work at all levels, global, national, regional, and local level. And I emphasize the local level, because that's where you build the resilience of the communities. That's where you engage people in preparing to cope with the challenges and the impacts of climate change. And I'm not saying to you that migration is the solution. No. Migration is one of the solutions, and I can guarantee you that people would have to prefer to live where they have always lived instead of moving. But in some cases, moving is necessary, and that should be done in a safe, orderly, and regular way. That's what we do with ECOWAS in Africa and in the Middle East. That's what we do with IGAD in the East and the Horn of Africa. That's what we do in the Pacific Islands or in the Caribbean. To conclude, relax, to conclude, as the economic and human costs of climate inaction loom large on our collective well-being, I believe that human mobility must be central to our efforts tackling climate change. Climate adaptation may not succeed unless migration considerations are integrated. Efforts to address loss and damage will not be impactful without considering displacement, its impacts, and above all, designing durable solutions to end it. You owe me 15 seconds.
Your grandmother has raised you well, Mr. Vitorino. Our next speaker is the Director General for Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid at DG ECHO. I'm delighted to give the floor to Ms. Paraskevi Miho. Give her an applause.
Well, in which challenge Antonio has put me now. But fortunately for me, a lot that I wanted to say, you said it. Thank you, Ali. And thank you all for following up, not only now, but for me it's the first session to speak. So thank you for participating in this event, which is, I'm very glad because it's the first event that we see each other as well, the last 2 years. Well, I will not tell you that we are very concerned at EU about the ever-increasing number of people displaced annually across the world by disaster and the adverse effects of climate change. And of course, it was said, and Antonio said it, that we have now to see very close here in Europe but also before in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Sahel, everywhere where we are looking at DG ECHO to see how many people are displaced, not only because of the climate. But today what I want to say, and I will skip many of these numbers that it was already said, we had, I think Viviane Clement from the World Bank is in the room. I have read the study that we have commissioned, and what it is said there, it said that by 2050, the number of people displaced by climate change internally will be at the figure of 220 million by 2050. That means half of the population of Europe, actually, of the 27 member states. So this is really worrying. And of course, planning, strategy is very important. Funding is also very important. And I'm here to speak to you what we are doing in order to make sure that we have and we contribute to all of this. So our budget, the EU humanitarian budget, allocated for disasters caused by natural hazards, has steadily going up over the years, and 56% of all EU-funded humanitarian projects have included a disaster preparedness component over the past 5 years. We have adopted last year a new approach on disaster preparedness, and our action now integrates both response and preparedness programs, as well as tools such as emergency toolbox, a funding instrument that is designed to respond to unexpected emergencies in a record time. But EU action in this area is not only humanitarian, it was said. And over the next 5 years, 10% of the financial envelope from the Global Europe instrument will be dedicated to action supporting management and governance of migration and forced displacement, and 30% will be allocated to climate actions. In addition, the EU remains committed to supporting and contributing to the international platforms and processes. Some of them were already said, and I would like only to highlight one and also to show our interest. We are going to take over the chairmanship of the platform on disaster displacement on the 1st of July of this year. I'm convinced that with our chairmanships, not only we give the sign, but we, most importantly, we will even more contribute to raising the issue of disaster and climate-related displacement higher in the agenda and to promote coordinated action and global efforts for more actions in this area. The displacement and the disaster and climate-related displacement is very complex, and it cannot only be addressed through a comprehensive and cooperation and coordination approach. This forum gives to all of us, gives to EU actors, our member states, our partners, international organizations, NGOs, the opportunity, all of us, to discuss together, strengthening the response before, during, and after. And this is long-term process. So before, by preparing for displacement and reducing the risk, and I have to tell you, Antonio, that the foresight approach, the foresight initiatives in the Commission, the last, after 2014-15, they have been increased a lot, and they have been a lot in the center of our policy initiatives. During, by responding to displacement when it occurs, mitigating the negative effects and promoting durable solutions, and after, by strengthening resilience and protection as part of the Nexus approach. We are not starting from scratch. Much have been done, but a lot are also happening. And we believe that we need to do it, and we have to do it, and we must do it. And I also believe that EU is on the steer of that in order not to leave nobody behind. Thank you. Did I keep the line?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Micho, and thank you indeed for your insights and also respecting the time limit. Our next speaker will talk in French. She's a member of the European Parliament. Her name is Caroline Roos. Please join me in welcoming her.
Merci à toutes et à toutes, et merci à la DG ECO pour cette invitation à venir échanger sur un sujet qui est très crucial. Je voulais aussi remercier les panélistes, Monsieur Victorio et Madame Michou, pour leurs mots d'introduction. Je ne vais pas revenir sur les chiffres qui ont déjà été donnés par les deux intervenants précédents. Mais vous avez toutes et tous pris connaissance du rapport du GIEC paru au début du mois qui est apocalyptique. Je ne vais pas revenir sur les chiffres, sinon le modérateur va faire des gros yeux sur le temps de parole. Même si le comptage précis des personnes déplacées par les effets du changement climatique demeure complexe, leur nombre ne va faire que augmenter. Donc aujourd'hui, on est sur une urgence absolue, protéger durablement les millions de personnes concernées dès maintenant en transformant les outils existants. En effet, les causes des migrations se combinent et les changements climatiques exacerbent des difficultés préexistantes sur la sécurité alimentaire, divers conflits. Alors je vais prendre un exemple concret puisque je me suis rendue au Sénégal il y a à peu près un mois Et dans ce pays, on a 17% de la population active qui travaille dans le secteur de la pêche artisanale. Et seulement depuis quelques années, on se retrouve avec des jeunes pêcheurs qui se retrouvent sans emploi, sans nourriture, du fait de la surexploitation des stocks des petits poissons, dont ils dépendent directement pour leur subsistance au niveau de leur sécurité alimentaire. Tout ça parce qu'on a des puissances étrangères qui vont à destination de ces pays pour tout ce qui est industrie minotière. Mais aussi, on a des effets croissants du changement climatique qui conduit une réduction progressive de la taille de ces poissons et la migration de ces stocks. Donc ces stocks se déplacent vers le nord. Et dans ce contexte-là, faute de moyens de subsistance, de nourriture, donc de problématiques de sécurité alimentaire pour leurs familles, on a de plus en plus de Sénégalais, de jeunes Sénégalais qui prennent la mer dans leurs pirogues, dans le cadre de la migration intra-régionale en Afrique, mais aussi pour tenter de traverser la Méditerranée, rejoindre les îles Canaries en Espagne au péril de leur vie. Donc, lorsqu'ils réussissent à traverser, ils se heurtent à un durcissement et à la dureté de notre système de migration et d'asile européen. Je fais un deuxième constat par rapport aux pays les plus fragiles, qui sont ceux qui sont aussi les plus vulnérables au changement climatique, aux effets du changement climatique, ce qui rend le sentiment d'injustice climatique encore plus fort. Deux exemples sur lesquels je travaille depuis le début de mon mandat. Je vais prendre le premier exemple, c'est Madagascar. Madagascar, c'est l'un des pays les plus pauvres du monde aujourd'hui, qui a été confronté à un cyclone il n'y a pas très longtemps, avec plus de 50 000 personnes déplacées dans le pays. Depuis 2 ans, le sud du pays fait face à une sécheresse climatique historique, qualifiée par le Programme alimentaire mondial des Nations Unies de première famine liée aux effets du changement climatique. On a 1,5 million de personnes en situation d'insécurité alimentaire dans la région. Le mois prochain, je me rendrai à Madagascar avec une délégation du Parlement européen pour voir un petit peu ce qui se passe sur place. Un second pays pour lequel on a signé une résolution d'urgence au Parlement européen, c'est Haïti. Alors ce pays traverse des crises multidimensionnelles, politiques, sociales et économiques, qui est très profonde depuis des années. C'est aussi un pays très vulnérable aux catastrophes naturelles et aux effets du changement climatique, avec des risques sismiques, sécheresse, etc., qui impactent ce pays. Et tous ces exemples, ils ont un lien, ils ont lieu juste sous nos yeux. Et pourtant, l'inaction climatique, le manque de solidarité demeure. Et pour moi, nous n'allons pas assez loin. J'espère que la session d'aujourd'hui va permettre d'avancer vers des pistes d'action ambitieuses, puisque depuis 2015, la plateforme sur les déplacements liés aux catastrophes naturelles, elle a permis des avancées. Donc, par exemple, la reconnaissance des droits pour les déplacés internes dans certains pays, ou certaines avancées techniques. Moi, je suis très intéressée d'entendre aujourd'hui les propositions pour améliorer le travail de cette plateforme. Cependant, à mon sens, il nous faut prendre des mesures systémiques, notamment à l'échelle européenne. On a vu l'échec de la COP26 pour les pays les plus vulnérables, les petits États insulaires, qui demandaient la reconnaissance du principe juridique de perte et préjudice pour permettre le dédommagement des catastrophes désormais inévitables qui frapperont les pays et qui vont pousser les femmes et les hommes sur les routes et les mers. Ceci, pourtant, lors de la COP26, ça leur a été refusé. Donc l'Union européenne, elle doit être leader pour avancer sur le sujet lors des prochaines COP et par ailleurs pour augmenter les financements, comme vous l'avez dit tout à l'heure, à l'adaptation au changement climatique à destination des pays en développement. Alors, il est également clair que la Convention de Genève de 1951, telle qu'elle était définie et qu'elle définit le statut des réfugiés, elle n'est pas adaptée aux migrations climatiques aujourd'hui. On doit prendre en compte les effets du changement climatique lors de l'examen des demandes d'asile dans les pays de l'Union européenne, développer de nouveaux instruments, des visas humanitaires et des visas spéciaux pour les déplacés climatiques. L'Union européenne et la communauté internationale, elles doivent créer un cadre de protection pour ces personnes. Sur la problématique de la migration liée au climat, ça devrait être une base légale pour demander l'asile. La destruction des moyens de subsistance dus au changement climatique pourrait aussi devenir un critère d'éligibilité pour la protection humanitaire, la délivrance des visas humanitaires, l'octroi d'une protection temporaire. On l'a vu, ça s'est fait par rapport à ce qui se passe aujourd'hui avec le conflit en Ukraine et c'est très positif. L'Union européenne et la communauté internationale pourraient aussi prévoir la création de canaux de migration sûrs et régulières pour les personnes déplacées pour le climat. Donc voilà, quelques pistes pour alimenter l'action de l'Union européenne. Et j'ai hâte de vous entendre aujourd'hui sur les échanges. Et moi, en tant que députée européenne de la Commission du développement, je ne peux qu'exhorter les acteurs de l'humanitaire, les participants à ce forum, à agir pour avancer sur ces questions. Plus largement, j'insiste sur le fait que malgré son importance cruciale, l'action humanitaire, à elle seule, elle ne suffira pas. Oui, elle ne suffira pas, je vois qu'on me fait signe. Elle ne suffira pas et cette problématique, elle peut être vue que sous cet angle. Donc l'enjeu désormais, c'est de s'y adapter et d'en limiter les conséquences. Et ça passe par une solidarité avec celles et ceux dont les foyers, les ressources et les terres seront complètement détruites. Merci beaucoup. J'ai respecté mon temps de parole.
Madame Rouge. Let me point out that Slido is open for your questions and comments, and we do welcome those. And at the end of the session, as I said before, we will try to deal with as many of your comments as we can. And to join us on Slido, oh, there it is. You need the EHF-AB event code. It is high time to invite the members of the panel to the floor. Could you please come forward and make yourselves comfortable on the chairs? Oh, careful. Perfect. It's perfect. Thank you very much. Each speaker will again have 7 minutes to offer us an introductory statement. Hereafter, we'll take some interventions from the floor and make time for interaction. Let me introduce the speakers to you. In the middle is sitting Ms. Runa Khan, founder and executive director of Friendship. Next to her, on the right from my perspective, is Mr. Atle Solberg, head of the Secretariat of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. And closer to me is Mr. Andrew Harper, Special Advisor on Climate Action to UNHCR. Joining us online, not sure if he's there yet, I hope he is the Deputy Director General for the Directorate General, G&R at DG INTPA. Are you there, sir, Mr. Martin Seychelles? There you are. Fantastic.
Yes, indeed. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Please give all of our speakers a warm applause. I'd like to give the floor first to Mr. Harper, and there's a microphone in front of you. Could you please share with us some thoughts about the recent work of UNHCR in the field of climate-related displacement?
Okay, no, thank you very much. And for those people who don't know, there's a massive big screen there with a big clock. so there's no possible way that we can miss the timing.
You're making the moderator very replaceable. Thank you.
So innovation in dealing with climate change is important. No, thank you very much. And I think we've probably all been dealing with climate action for much longer than we've probably realized, whether it's been under the guise of environment or renewable energy. But 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, the High Commissioner said, what we need to be doing is bringing it all together. And it was probably a very similar time to almost a realization from many of us that what was key in dealing with climate action, it's not moving away from the climate crisis and dealing with climate action, is that we need to be doing it together. Because the numbers that have been quoted today are just so massive and the challenges are just so enormous that any one entity trying to make a significant difference is just going to fail. So the High Commissioner said, work very closely with our friends from IOM, with PDD, with member states, with regional institutions, with the NGOs, with everyone who's got a vested interest in the people who are most vulnerable. Because while many of us will be able to adapt to some extent, those people who are going to be most impacted are the ones who are not here. The ones who have already been displaced, those people in informal settlements, those people who are living on the periphery of society. And it's critical that when we talk about the impact of climate change on humanity, that we don't get sort of fixated on turf battles or silos. We have to be dealing with protection, we need to be dealing with human vulnerability, and we need to be trying to figure out how can we anticipate, as the Deputy Director mentioned, rather than react. And I think particularly when we're talking on the humanitarian side, it's no longer sufficient to wait on the other side of a border when the science and evidence is just so clear. It's also, we need to move away from sort of saying this is someone's turf or this is what we're doing, because the complexities of people's displacement and why people are moving is just so complex. And people often will be talking about what is the issue of climate refugees. Well, firstly, the vast majority of people are displaced internally. So let's try and address the vulnerability and the threats closer to home so people don't become forced to cross an international border. And so that means that we can't be addressing these issues only on a humanitarian basis. We need to be looking at development, but also we need to be looking at governance. What are the challenges? What are the threats? And we also very much get fixated on climate. It's not just climate, it's also environmental degradation. It's also poor governance. It's also a lack of equity. It's a lack of sustainability in terms of how we derive income from the environment. So unless you look at these elements in a holistic approach, you're not going to succeed. So in terms of UNHCR's strategy on climate action, there was 4 key points. I have to put them where they are. The first one was on collaboration, which we talked about. The other one is community-based. There's a lot of discussions at New York and Brussels and Geneva and Rome and elsewhere. But what represents protection, and what do people wish to achieve in terms of combating the impact of climate change at the community level? And so if we're not talking to the people on the ground, we're going to fail. Evidence-based. There's never been a time when there's been so much data and evidence in which to help us make informed decisions. We can no longer say we're surprised. You can't say that you're surprised because of outdated attitudes, because everything which is informing us now is saying that the situation is going to deteriorate, it's going to deteriorate rapidly. We have to be better prepared. And this goes back to one of the key elements. How do we support preparedness and adaptation? I was in South Sudan last week, going up the White Nile, and you had tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who will probably be displaced during the next wet season. Mm-hmm. So there's anticipatory action. We know what's going to happen, but there's nothing happening. There's no action to build upon the evidence and data that we know. I'm using South Sudan as an example, but it's also the lack of access to water, challenging for herds to survive in increasingly drought-filled environments. So let's move from just talking about things to actually the implementation of action. So over the last 2 years, and again, this is not necessarily something which we've done by ourselves, because if you develop a strategy by yourself, you're not going to go anywhere. So working particularly closely also with IOM and the EU, but also with NGOs and PDD, we developed, try and get this out, we developed a strategic framework for climate action. And that framework is based on 3 pillars. First one is the law and policy, which many people can relate to UNHCR. We're guardians of the 951 Convention, 67 Protocol. And people will sort of say, well, what is the linkage there with climate displacement? Well, the linkage there is that 90% of the world's refugees come from countries on the front lines of the climate challenge war. And on top of that, 70% of the world's IDPs come from countries with the least capacity to adapt to the climate crisis. So there is that buy-in there that many people already fleeing are fleeing from both an issue of conflict and climate. And what we're also finding is that if they flee from both those elements, then it's very difficult for people to return. Second pillar of the 3 pillars is operations. How do we build up the resilience of those communities so they're not forced to move again? How do we support adaptation and preparedness? Also, how do we reduce the impact of refugees on the local environment? Again, lots that can be done. We're just not doing enough. Any of us are not doing enough in that terms. Also doing lots of work on predictive analytics. We'll talk about that in a little while. Anticipatory action. And the third one is reducing our own environmental footprint. And you sort of say, okay, one agency, what difference you'll make. We've got 4,000 diesel generators. That's a big difference. We've got hundreds of partners, 500 officers, 3 seconds to go, and we can do much better. Done.
That was great.
Oh, sorry.
No, your hand, just a hand. An applause for Mr. Harper, thank you very much. An applause is your hands together, yes? So Mr. Harper talked about the importance of working with communities. An excellent example of working with communities is the work of the organization called Friendship, and the founder, coincidentally, is with us, and executive director. Could you please talk, Ms. Khan, about the work that you do and how that affects the communities that you work with? And they are some of the communities that are most affected by climate-related impacts.
Thank you. So 20 years trying to kind of push it into 2, 3, 5 minutes is... Oh, sorry. So 20 years trying to fit it into 2, 3, 4, 7 minutes is not easy. But, you know, 20 years ago, when climate change was still not fashionable and nor a reality as it is today, nor were the fear of impact as we know it today. Scientists were warning, vision leaders were trying to address the issues, but all I saw was in the remotest part of a country like Bangladesh, communities were migrating, remigrating, remigrating. Millions left unaddressed, unserved, no accesses to services that we took for granted. And I wondered how this could be possible. You know, where apparently the government was trying, people were kind, and there were thousands of NGOs with millions of dollars, you know, all trying to work. And there were these millions of people whom nothing was reaching. And I realized today that these were the hidden climate migrants of Bangladesh. What I saw resulted in anger, pain, at the injustice. I started Friendship trying to meet basic human needs of what I felt were some of the most unaddressed communities on the planet, not realizing that they were really the direct impact, they had the direct impact of climate injustice. Because internal displacement, as you well know, and inter-country migration is often silent and it's invisible. So we started the first system of mobile delivery of essential services. Because every time a person was migrating, they were losing everything. They were just standing by themselves, alone. And this has become the Friendship Climate Adaptation System, servicing direct service access to 7 million people a year today. This meant dependable services were reaching the migrants, and the migrants were being equipped and empowered to take their lives into their own hands through training, awareness, education, and as Mr. Vitorino very rightly said, preparedness, preparedness, preparedness. You have to be prepared of the inevitable climate disasters which were occurring over the last 20 years. I saw more and more. Managing the losses, understanding how to do that, learning to deal with the ecosystem, you know, of a new place, both socio-economic and political ecosystems. And in every action, ensuring to restart their life, they needed to be strengthened in dignity and self-respect. In a country like Bangladesh, due to predictable climate issues has been happening, you know, historically, but you know, it makes a real deep difference when it becomes unpredictable, of a magnitude which is huge, and the demography over the years which has become enormous. Country of 170 million people, 148,000 square kilometer, 65%, about 50% of the time under the water. 7th on the climate risk index, 1 meter rise, 1/5 of the country goes underwater, becoming the foremost in number of people to be impacted. 42 million, it's predicted by 2050. So I started with the first mobile ship hospitals in the country. limited, secondary care, preventive cares, community-trained medics who were doing M-Healths, all a mobile system. Risk assessments, community preparedness, ensuring, like some amount of mitigation. We are the foremost in mangrove reforestation, for example. Banana plants, rafts. Last year, year before last, we had Molida, who is a flood volunteer. She made a banana raft of banana stalks and carried 45 women and children to safety. She's not a doctor, but she saved lives. Interventions on food security, fishing, ensuring that communities know how to deal with their political ecosystem, and dealing with the hidden issues of injustice like child marriage, ensuring that through the communities, people learn, that people develop so that they could continue their service delivery. At the end of it, if we do not empower, and COVID has taught us this, it is themselves who need to take this in their hand. However much we try to do, it is not going to be enough. We are far away. Even I am only an intermediary. I am not the face. We need to see the face to understand the reality and the impact. And over 20 years, we have done these adaptation solutions built on mobility for these victims.
Thank you so far, Ms. Khan. In the remainder of your time, I'd like to ask you to talk about how we can promote durable solutions to this very pressing issue. And maybe you can give us some examples of how you are doing it in Bangladesh.
Yes, thank you. So, first of all, for example, we have hospital ships, which does the services, follows the people in the communities. Second, our schools are all mobile. In a sense, they can be moved around, and teachers are from the community. So even if they move, they are equipped. At the end of every decision, or at the end of every sector that we have got, or every work we do, we empower communities. So the communities can take off. For example, our paralegal aides know how to connect to the government. So even if they're migrating, they can still access the government services because we train them in the basics, of how to act with the government. So even when we have, things like village theaters, which are bringing forth hidden issues. And what is extremely important, is to understand and have humility that none of us can solve everything. There is no panacea. It is so multifaceted. Climate change is multifaceted. Impact is multifaceted. Any solutions we bring forth is multifaceted, has to be multifaceted. But within that, one thing we need to understand, that when we work with the communities, they need to trust you. You need to work with the values of your organization, not as a limiting factor, but on the very base you work with. This gives trust, and for me, I would say the soft skills, which friendship imbued, is even greater than the hard skills. Hard skills are hospitals and ships and schools and all this, but the soft skills is what makes a person, when they have fallen, stand up and walk again. Thank you. 5 seconds more.
Mr. Solberg of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, the EU will be chairing that platform starting the 1st of July. It'll be for a period of 18 months. My question to you is twofold. What are the main challenges in that period of 18 months? And what would you recommend to the EU in terms of its priorities?
Thank you, Ali. And I have an aim to say 7 things in 7 minutes. So let's see if I manage that. I just need first to thank the European Union, and we are looking very much forward for them to take over the chairmanship of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. The PDD is a follow-up to the Nansen initiative, so several governments have been involved from the outset: Norway, Switzerland, France, Germany, Bangladesh, and now Fiji. So we are looking very much forward to work with the EU in the next 18 months. I don't think I need to say much more about the problem statement around disaster displacement and why that is important and why we need to scale up our efforts. We have heard some of the trends and the numbers. The first point I want to say to the EU, I'm head of the Secretariat, so this is our technical input to the European Union when they assume the chairmanship. The first point, don't forget the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda. If you really want to have a blueprint for a comprehensive approach, look back to the protection agenda. It was endorsed by 109 states, and it was built on a broad consultative process over many years. I think the problem statement of the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda is clearly valid today, but we may look into some of the gaps and how we have advanced on gaps regarding knowledge and data, gaps regarding legal and policy development. We heard earlier that there are some gaps at international level when people are moving across international border. There are clearly institutional operational gaps and also funding gaps, particularly in those situations that are not that visible, solution situation and also slow onset events. So don't forget the protection agenda and some of the policy instrument that has been identified as useful to scale up. If you don't forget the protection agenda, you clearly need to also focus on, as part of that argument, the climate change action agenda and the Paris Agreement on the Framework Convention. There are, of course, a huge challenge to talk about displacement in an overall climate change and a resilience agenda, but there are opportunities going forward under the Warsaw International Mechanism on loss and damage. There is a task force on displacement established under the Warsaw International Mechanism, and there's also ongoing efforts to support the establishment of a network, or the Santiago network, on loss and damage. And that is a specific entry point for the platform and the European Union going forward to support the focus on displacement. Unfortunately, we are into loss and damage territory already. The IPCC report refers to hard adaptation limits. These are situations where we really need to prepare for displacement. The third point, don't forget the Sendai Framework of Disaster Risk Reduction, which has several elements that we can work on. And there are also specific operational opportunities. Together with UNDRR, the platform, and other partners such as the Norwegian Refugee Council, we have developed a words into action on disaster displacement. Let's work together to roll that out further. We have already heard today the importance of anticipatory action, anticipatory risk modeling, and anticipatory financing. That is also an opportunity to go forward. I think the next couple of years for the platform will also be important, as we heard from Director General Vittorino, the Sendai midterm review process. Let's take stock also after Sendai framework, how we are doing on target E around national capacity building on national DRR strategies, and also on target B, which is essentially to reduce the number of people affected by disaster. The fourth point I think we need to work on going forward is the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. In May, there is an International Migration Review Forum. We will take stock of challenges and progress of the Global Compact, but the Compact will be with us, and beyond the International Migration Review Forum, there will be movement to strengthen the regional and capacity building efforts. We have done some preliminary assessment of the implementation of the Global Compact when it comes to climate change and disaster. And we are doing quite well, or countries are doing quite well, in terms of integrating displacement consideration into adaptation and disaster risk reduction efforts. Progress is less prominent when it comes to pathways. What types of instruments can be applied when people are forced to move across international border? We heard earlier today humanitarian visa, temporary protection status. There is a range of migration policy tools that we can turn to. That was my fourth point to the European Union. My fifth is the high-level panel on internal displacement that presented its report last year. There's currently a Secretary General action agenda, a draft action agenda. Let's look at that action agenda when it comes through, and let's work together to support implementation. As Andrew said earlier, most people in those circumstances we are talking about are internally displaced, and we need to drastically scale up efforts to avert, minimize, and address internal displacement. And when we are talking about internal displacement, it's probably more an implementation gap rather than a normative gap. So we should build up our capacity. My fifth point, or my sixth point, is data and knowledge. We are into a very complex risk landscape. Risks are escalating across sectors and regions. We need to have better tools to forecast and project the future. So what the PDD has been doing since 2016, working very closely with partners, in particular the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, IOM, Displacement Tracking Matrix, UNHCR. We need to build better models and better capacity to deal with data. And the seventh point I want to talk to the European Union about is how do we strengthen multilateral coordination? The landscape, the ecosystem of agencies and states working around the issues of climate change, disaster and displacement and human mobility is very complex. There's no clear leadership in the United Nations. There is even within governments struggling to find who deals with what. How do we work together? And I think as we move towards the European chairmanship, there will be a strategic review of the PDD, its orientation in the future, and maybe one legacy of the European Union could leave a platform with a clearer identity and a clearer understanding what shall the platform be, being positioned in between all these actors, and maybe going towards a 2030 agenda, what will be or how will these issues being dealt from a coordination perspective when we move towards 2030. That was 12 seconds over time, I'm so sorry. Thank you.
Maybe this time pressure is symbolic for the time pressure that we should be feeling when it comes to climate change. Our last but not least speaker on the panel is Mr. Martin Seychelles, Deputy Director General for the Directors GNR at DG INTPA. Good afternoon, Mr. Seychelles. How are you?
Good afternoon.
The next
Pleasure
7 minutes are yours. Go ahead.
Yes,
I forget, by the way,
thank you,
that I should tell the audience what you will talk about. My apologies.
Indeed.
So you'll be talking about climate-related displacement from the perspective of development cooperation. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the question, and also for the opportunity to say a few words on this very important topic. According to the International Displacement Monitoring Center, in 2020 alone, approximately 30.7 million new displacements were triggered by disasters. That's more than 3 times the number of displacements caused by conflict and violence. And according to the World Bank, 216 million people worldwide could move within their countries by 2050. Some of these disasters can indeed be extreme, and I'll start with an example. The example of the Kingdom of Tonga in the Pacific, a country with over 170 islands and a population of some 100,000. In January, a violent volcanic eruption and its induced tsunami waves resulted in the displacement of about 2.5% of the total population of the island. Luckily, the tsunami warning and previous experience of the islanders with these phenomena allowed people to evacuate. However, 84% of the total population in Tonga has been directly or indirectly affected. The tsunami swept away houses, damaged infrastructure, the ash caused breathing problems, affected water supply, destroyed crops. I'm mentioning this because these examples indeed show how multifaceted these disasters can be and just how many sectors they can impact. In some cases, displaced communities can return home soon after disasters, but in many other cases, their homes and land are lost, leaving them displaced for years to come. And some find they have no choice but to return to an area highly exposed to future hazards. Many responses to disaster displacement tend to focus on short-term humanitarian actions aimed at saving lives and stabilizing crises, and humanitarian support is undoubtedly needed. Nevertheless, disaster displacement goes well beyond the emergency response. It affects many other aspects of national development, such as in the case of the example I mentioned in Tonga, health and economy, but also education, human rights, many other things. A disaster displacement, therefore, has long-term development implications. And consequently, we need a response that is developmental in its outlook. The conditions of humanitarian crisis may have improved, but the challenges of prevention, mitigation, building resilience, and finding longer-term solutions remain. Let me come back to the Tonga example. The preparedness of the Tongan government has contributed to reduce the amounts of loss of lives. Only 3 direct and 1 indirect fatality have been officially recorded. Many island states in the Pacific have improved their resilience to disasters by strengthening their early warning systems. And this was possible, certainly in the case of Tonga, thanks to EU development funding. With our partners, the International Displacement Monitoring Center, as well as the IOM, we have supported regional and national efforts to reduce the risk and impact of disaster displacement on persons at risk, particularly in areas like the Pacific. Information and data have allowed governments to make proactive rather than reactive choices. Knowledge on the issue has also increased over the last years with the support of the EU, and the capacity gap to monitor the issue at all levels of government is narrowing. We don't only work, of course, on research or data, we work also on prevention and mitigation. I could point out the important work we do together with GIZ in Fiji, for instance, where we are relocating vulnerable households and schools that are impacted by sea level rise and flooding. And actions like this are ongoing in many other parts of the world. In order to make progress towards achieving the SDGs, we need to work more consistently to address the longer-term developmental challenges that disaster displacement poses. We need to address the issue through an integrated and comprehensive approach to prevent where possible, to prepare and anticipate such movements by adapting, mitigating, and reversing the state of the degraded environment and climate, to help people who are on the move, to strengthen their resilience and protection, including through transparent governance and tenure rights. We should help the countries that are at risk of climate-induced displacement to find solutions that are economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. Development plans and budgets at national and subnational levels need to take proper account of the challenges related to disaster displacement. Donor states should support this shift through an enhanced cooperation with countries impacted by such challenges. As I said before, we need to look beyond the humanitarian response, and we need to find the right approach to tackle the developmental challenges that remain. Even when the conditions of the humanitarian crisis have improved. How can we build resilience? How can we find longer-term solutions? How can development actors support? The answers are in data, in capacity building, and above all, in partnerships. Gathering and using development-relevant data on internal displacement that integrates both the humanitarian and development concerns is very much needed, as well as support to countries in strengthening or adapting their national data systems and methods to better monitor, report, prepare, and respond to disaster displacement, like we did in the Pacific, which is why I mentioned it as an example. Moreover, we need to support incipient efforts to improve global partnerships and processes on displacement, internal or external, prompted by disasters, climate change, and environmental degradation. And this will contribute to an improved coordination and cooperation between and the further strengthening of the humanitarian and development architecture. As some of you may know, the European Union will be the chair of the Platform for Disaster Displacement as of July 2022 for a period of 18 months. And one of our key priorities will be to offer this comprehensive approach to climate-induced displacement. We hope to seize the opportunity that this will provide to convene like-minded, bring change, and encourage awareness and tangible results to address this global issue, a very pressing issue, if I may say so. And we need all of you, and we need to partner with all of you to step up our joint policy and to make our comprehensive approach a reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Seychelles. Hope you can hear the applause. It is time for interaction, but before I make space for that, we have a video message from Christina, a young leader affected by the climate crisis in Mozambique. Let's play the video.
Saudação, titio, e muito obrigado por me deixar falar neste encontro. O meu nome é Cristina, tenho 18 anos de idade e vivo no distrito de Mkuba, no centro de Moçambique. E o último ciclone, Eloise, destruiu muitas casas, igreja, machamba e algumas árvores também caíram na minha comunidade. Aquelas colônias passou de noite. Em casa tínhamos duas casas, outra coberta de capim e outra coberta de chapa. As duas casas não eram seguras. O meu pai disse para mudarmos a casa de chapa para irmos viver na casa de capim. Mas logo que chegamos, a casa de capim caiu. No dia seguinte, aquela outra casa também caiu. Até vi casas da casa vizinha também a caírem. É triste ver uma criança dormir num lugar inseguro. Como não tínhamos lugar para dormir, nós fomos na igreja. Lá os padres nos deram comida, manta, água para uma semana. Mesmo assim era difícil para dormirmos lá, porque dormíamos no chão frio. Lá havia 20 pessoas, crianças, mulheres, adultos, dormíamos no mesmo sítio. Não tinham privacidade, não havia espaço para tomar banho. As mulheres tomavam banho de noite para não ser vistas, violadas. Eu tinha medo para ser violada porque não queria ficar grávida. Ficar grávida ia significar estragar a minha escola e também estragar o meu sonho para ser professora. Até hoje, sempre que chove muito, eu fico com medo. É muito triste ver uma criança com medo de chuva. Desde o ciclone, a vida piorou na minha casa e na minha comunidade. Eu recordo quando fiquei desalojada, não foi brincar, não foi na machamba, não foi na escola. É muito triste ser uma pessoa desalojada. Até hoje, meu pai não conseguiu construir uma casa melhor. Em nome das pessoas desalojadas, por causa das mudanças climáticas, estou a pedir aos líderes da União Europeia e do mundo para tomar esta medida. Estou a pedir aos governos que investem na educação. Com a educação, podemos saber viver em lugares seguros. Eu quero que todos os líderes acabem com a mudança climática. Que isto continuar, o mundo vai acabar. Nós queremos casas mais fortes contra o ciclone. Não queremos viver de um lugar para outro. Eu quero um mundo seguro para todas as crianças. Não mais mudanças climáticas. Não mais crianças desalojadas. E muito obrigado por me ouvir. Tchau.
She cannot hear us, but let's thank Christina nonetheless. Thanks, Christina. I think her message very vividly shows the intersection between climate, being a vulnerable community in a poor country, but also belonging to certain groups in society that are particularly vulnerable, like being a woman or being a girl. I know that, Ms. Khan, you work with communities that are quite similar, perhaps, to the community that Christina is from. What is your response to this message?
So this is one child. Thank you. This is one child, and there are millions that we see. You know, she said education. Why did she say education? Actually, suffering was number one, because when you're suffering, no other intervention is even near you. So you need to deal with that. Fear. You need to deal with fear, because each of these migrants are afraid. We need to ensure education, because that is the only thing that gives hope. This is what she wanted. And it's so important. How do you give hope? How do you have sustainable education in a context where you are migrating, where you have to migrate? For example, on the Brahmaputra, on the rivers, even the land breaks. And your homes are swept away, even the land you're standing on is swept away. So we need to have holistic solution, not projects, not programs. You have to think of the community for them to be able to restart their life. And I think that is what she wants.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that interpretation. Before I give the floor to Ms. Clément, and I'll introduce her to you in a second, she is in the room. Am I right? Could you please raise your hand so we know where you are?
I'm here online.
Online. My apologies. Indeed, that's what my paper is saying. I apologize, I stand corrected. We'll get to you in a second, but first I'd like to ask a question that we received via Slido, and I think that question could be for you, sir. Is there a joint plan between UN agencies, NGOs, the Red Cross family, on a joint coordination action plan for climate change? And I think you also touched on it, Ms. Khan, when you said there needs to be a holistic approach.
Not at this point, other than sort of aspirational. I would say that almost all the agencies are working together in a spirit of collaboration. We're obviously working through the PDD as well. But I think the challenge is bringing it back down from the policy and ambition to actually the impact level. So it's got to be holistic, but we've also got to start making a difference on the ground. And there was the ICRC, IFRC driven humanitarian charter, which I think UNHCR was the first UN agency to sign. But it's the next step down. It's the operational level which we need to make a difference. And I am going to take a second here and comment on Christina's intervention, because it's completely right. It's not just an isolated event. And we're not doing enough. Like, we don't sense the urgency. And we're not holding ourselves accountable. Whenever we go out to the field, we need to say we're making a difference. And I'll be 1 minute. But we did a focus group session with some women and girls in South Sudan. And they were scared. They were really, really scared, because they were saying that every day when we go out looking for firewood, men know where to wait for us. And we will, if we don't have sex with them, they will rape us. And it wasn't an issue of if, it's when. And this is something which we can address. So when we talk about climate change, when we talk about our actions, we have a responsibility to protection, the most fundamental elements of protection. And when you talk to these, like the girls, like they were going to school, and they said, like, after school, we've got to work for 2 hours, walk for 2 hours to get the wood, and it's getting dusk, but we don't want to get pregnant.
Okay.
So it wasn't an issue about getting raped. They will be raped. And this is the situation in these settlements that have been there for decades. And what was scary, what was really haunting me, was just almost the normalization of this sexual violence. And the feeling amongst many of the stakeholders there that they didn't really have to do much more than what they were currently doing. That was acceptable. It's not acceptable. In any situation, this is not acceptable. And if there's something which I would drive as far as climate action, is like, let's try and make a difference. Let's try and do something to protect the Christinas of the world. Let's give them something where they can not put themselves at risk. Let's provide them with a safe housing. Let's get them to schooling. Let's get, like, all these are within our power.
Yes. Let's turn words in action indeed. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Viviane Clément, Senior Climate Change Specialist at the World Bank and author of the Groundswell Report Part 2, Acting on Internal Climate Migration. For the next 5 minutes, the floor is yours, speaking remotely.
Thank you so very much. And thank you to the Forum for providing the World Bank with the opportunity to share the findings of our recent report on internal climate migration that we released last September. So this new report, Groundswell Acting on Internal Climate Migration, it includes projections and analyses for 3 additional regions: East Asia and the Pacific, North Africa, and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Qualitative analyses of climate-related mobility in the countries of the Mashrek and in small island developing states is also provided. The first report from 2018 covered Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. The report seeks to understand how climate-induced migration within countries could play out to 2050 and what action areas we can pursue. The reports apply a scenario-based modeling approach using state-of-the-art climate impact and demographic data to isolate out new movement induced by 3 slow onset climate factors Those are water availability, crop productivity, and sea level rise augmented by storm surge. And combined with validation, grounding in the literature, and tailored assessments, these scenarios can help inform policy dialogue and action. The results from the groundswell reports show, as others have mentioned earlier, that without early and concerted climate and development action, as many as 216 million people could move within their countries by 2050 as a consequence of slow onset climate change impacts. No region or country will be immune, but it is the poorest and those living in the most climate vulnerable areas that will be disproportionately impacted. Importantly, hotspots of internal climate migration could emerge as early as 2030 and continue to spread and intensify by 2050. But these hotspots are not predestined. There are three key takeaways from the reports. First is this potency of climate change to induce internal migration, as evidenced by the scale, the trends, and the patterns of migration across the regions that we studied. The second is the urgency to act now. We find that with far-sighted concrete climate and development action, the scale of internal climate migration could be reduced by as much as 80%, but that window of opportunity is rapidly narrowing. Third and final is the importance of locality and the need for strategies and solutions to be tailored in accordance with national and local contexts. And this is particularly important given that the causes of mobility and immobility, voluntary or involuntary, are multifaceted and interconnected. The groundswell reports underscore two overarching policy actions. First and foremost is the imperative at the global level to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with the Paris Agreement. This will help reduce the climate pressures that can compel people to migrate. Equally, the results of the analysis emphasize the importance and the urgency of inclusive development that is both resilient and green. Building systems to be resilient and livelihoods that are diversified can help people to stay in place or move away safely from risks if needed into areas of better conditions and prosperity. Internal climate migration can be an adaptation strategy resulting in positive development outcomes, but only if well planned and managed. Also important are the identification of concrete domains of action through national and regional processes that can usher in those opportunities for social and economic transformation. For example, those outlined in the European Green Deal and the EU Adaptation Strategy. The report also calls for investing in better understanding of climate migration to inform policies and planning. Internal climate migration can also be placed at that intersection of humanitarian development and peace partnerships, working with national and local stakeholders for those end-to-end solutions. Greater cooperation, information sharing, and action needs to be pursued between the development, humanitarian, security, and disaster risk reduction communities to support countries in taking holistic action across the mobility continuum. Strong regional and national institutions are essential to address the multidimensionality of the challenges, and locally led approaches working with civil society and community actors are critical to generate inclusive, participatory, and empowering solutions. In conclusion, we note that internal climate migration is a reality, but it does not have to be a crisis, and early and concerted action are key. Thank you very much for your attention today, and thank you again.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to take up one very important point from what you said, and that is the importance of integrating peace-building, development, and crisis response initiatives. And I'd like to turn to Mr. Solberg. Could you give us your point of view of how the EU could perhaps the Commission or any other organ in the EU, play the role of integrating those efforts, given the place that the EU has on the international stage?
Thank you, Ali. I struggle a little to talk to that peace nexus, that we have a mandate which is more focused on the natural hazard side on things. But I think I want to say a few things just to stress a few points. One is the distinction between peace and war, development, underdevelopment, climate crisis is somehow collapsing in front of us in many regions. And this distinction that we have, that certain things belong to certain UN agencies, certain things belong to a certain aspect of the government, that's probably no longer valid. And that's why it's very important what the Sendai framework speaks to multi-hazard early warning system. We need to bring in the entire risk landscape in our understanding. And I'm one of the first to say that hitting the ground, seeing the consequences of climate change, we need to be very broad-minded and open-minded. There's certain regions of the world where the prospect is quite easier to see, for example, in the Pacific. That's very much an existential climate change crisis that put even the existence of certain small island developing states or one of their islands that people can maintain human mobility. But if you move to other areas in Africa, in America, Central America, that distinction between humanitarian situation, development and peace are collapsing. And that's why we also promote these integrated approaches. You have to bring in the entire toolbox, the entire system. But sometimes we do benefit from distinguishing the war and the conflict situation in front of us, which shall be dealt with certain institutions. I think we see that in Ukraine at the moment, and that there are other situations which shall be dealt with by other part of the house, because there are rules of the game that are also applicable, for example, in conflict situations. We shall not forget those rules of the game and some of the obligation parties and states have. So thank you.
Thanks for that. Indeed, the problems seem to be working together, so everyone responsible for the solution should probably do the same, but respecting the rules of engagement. I'd like to trigger a response from the audience in the room and the audience, I should say participants in the room and participants online, with a poll on Slido. Could we please have the Slido slide once more? Join us on Slido if you haven't done so, by visiting sly.do and entering the event code #EHF-AB. The poll question, so it's a multiple choice question, reads as follows. The tech team is still working on showing it to you, so I'll wait with reading. There it is. Thank you very much. What is to you the most important international role that the EU should take on disaster and climate-related displacement? Think about the question for a second and then make your choice. The results will come in live. The first option that you can vote for is that the EU should, well, they're going to move around. The EU should push the international community to close the humanitarian funding gap, promote international policy coherence and multilateralism, firmly put the climate displacement nexus on the international agenda, and finally promote the role of the private sector as a part of the solution. What is to you the most important role that the EU should take? I'll give you a second to make up your mind. The votes are still coming in, but I think it's safe to say that probably a greater majority has voted for firmly put the climate displacement nexus on the international agenda. I'd like to turn to our remote panel member, Mr. Martin Seychelles. Are you still with us?
Yes, certainly.
What do you think of the outcome?
Well, yes, I mean, all that is, of course, very important, but I would very much agree with, putting, this nexus on the agenda, not, of course, just for its own sake, but because, as I mentioned earlier, we need to move away from this kind of um, thinking only in terms of short-term responses to emergencies. Of course, there is always an acute phase in these kind of situations, but all too often we kind of once we've addressed that immediate phase, we tend to kind of stop there. One thing we need to do is really, first of all, accept the fact that there are too many vulnerabilities in the world. We need to systematically address those vulnerabilities. So the point I was making earlier about linking this with the development agenda, there are far too many areas. I mean, whether it's spatial planning or energy supply or access to education, access to health, that are extremely fragile in today's world and can easily be disrupted by unforeseen events or events we could have foreseen,
Yes.
but for some reason did not. So I think the key message is we need, yes, to put this firmly on the agenda, but to ensure, because putting it on the political agenda without changing our approach is kind of beside the point. We need to put it on the agenda to actually really work with partner country governments and authorities and communities, as has been said, fundamentally communities. But of course, that needs support of the international community, because at a time when you have massive constraints and increasing constraints on fiscal space, for example, these countries and communities will need all the help they can
Yes.
get. But ultimately, we need to plan differently, and we need to mainstream, factor in, so issues like resilience, adaptation need to become central. It's not just about acute emergencies.
Thank you very much for that comment. As the results were coming in, next to me is sitting Andrew Harper. He said, interesting. Explain.
It's probably not that interesting because, like, we are in a.
Well, then never mind.
Because, like, we are in an echo chamber here. Like, we've got PDD, IOM, friendship. So we're all interested in the human mobility element of the discussion and the impact. So that was the interesting part.
Right.
But it's worth noting how much this has come up on the agenda. So when I was in Madrid a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, it wasn't even there. Like there was like we were trying to get invited to talk about refugees, and IOM was trying to talk about migrants, and no one wanted to talk to us. It wasn't on the agenda. To this stage, the EU recognises that this is a big issue because it is a huge issue. The issue of human mobility, whether it's migrants, displacement, is going to be one of the huge indicators of the capacity of the global community to adapt, prepare for the climate crisis which is unfolding. So it's good that it's there. It's interesting that it was raised, but it's probably not surprising.
Right.
Was that a good answer?
That's a great answer. Thanks so much. If it's very brief, because I still have two people on my list.
Very, very short. We are talking about solidarity. We are talking about filling in the gaps. Every single one of those questions are needed. You see, every single element is needed. We cannot isolate one solution from another. And I think this is something to keep in mind and not kind of select one above the other, because unless you're working in cooperation and everything is being done, you cannot come up with a result.
A holistic, comprehensive approach, indeed. Thanks a lot for that. Joining us remotely is also the head of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance and head of advocacy at Mercy Corps, Miss Lizzie Whitehead. Good afternoon.
Thanks, Ali. So for those that aren't aware, Mercy Corps is a humanitarian organisation working in over 40 countries, and most of these are fragile. Antonio and Martin noted earlier the importance of resilience, and that's core to all of our programming here at Mercy Corps. And yes, it is a development issue as well as humanitarian, and those worlds are coming closer together at speed, thank goodness. Climate resilience is at the core of our work at Mercy Corps. We want to see communities not just adapt, but to come out of a changing climate with new capabilities and be safer and be more productive and tackle climate justice. So we put resilience framework thinking around everything that we do to understand risks and then seek to specifically understand the threats that climate change brings to all of our work. And we look to governance as a vital starting point. And Runa mentioned this earlier, and she called it the political ecosystem. I think that's a much better word than governance. None of you will be surprised to hear that prevention is key. So in the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance program, we know that for every dollar invested in prevention, we're saving $5 in future losses. But sadly, as we heard earlier today, the amount of climate finance for adaptation is pitifully low and goals are being missed. We're delivering a package of work in our program to improve local early warning systems with a particular focus on gender transformative approaches. And we want to improve community disaster planning and improve local governments for DRR, improving budgets and advocating for better global investments in adaptation. Atle, it was good to hear you just mention the importance of multi-hazard risk planning, and that's exactly what we're doing. So we started with floods, and we're building that out now to think about urban heat and wildfires as well, and we're building that into one package of approach. So you're spot on. Wider in Mercy Corps, we have other programs that are building resilience as well as dealing with disasters. We have one in Nepal and Timor-Leste, which actually plans community action before a disaster has happened. And we're putting in place things like sugarcane planting alongside riverbanks. So communities are actually making money out of nature-based solutions that it's going to help them recover from a disaster quicker. And our results show that those profits are being reinvested into better agricultural practices. And we've seen a 13% decline in migration after a disaster. And like Andrew said, we're working on keeping people within their own communities instead of them having to forcibly leave. In other programs in Jordan, we know that 1 in 14 people in Jordan are registered refugees, and that has put a huge pressure on the host population. We're building education programs and health programs and public service programs to help relieve that stress, and underpinning all of our work, we have a determined focus on resilience. More broadly, in Mercy Corps, we're working on building evidence about what we know about the relationship between climate and conflict. And I think we've all heard today that that's not a very easy and open relationship. There's huge multifaceted challenges around understanding that. But we have a few things that we've prioritized in terms of how we're working on this interface. We are developing and implementing integrated multi-sector approaches around this nexus, and we are growing the evidence base for what works. And it was good to hear people earlier talking about predictive models, and we're using some predictive analytical tools in Ethiopia to understand forecast climate data with conflict. And it's great to hear that others have seen that this is an area we need to invest more in. Atle, we wish you luck as you lead the platform on disaster displacement, and we're very heartened to see that you already have plans around UNFCCC, Warsaw International Mechanism. And it was great to hear you speak about this earlier. The quicker we can move to a firm and understandable structure with good TA, technical assistance, and good finance options for loss and damage, the better. And finally, the leadership role that the EU is playing on tracking climate finance is exemplary. In your humanitarian aid communication, you voluntarily applied the 30% climate mainstreaming target to your humanitarian aid. And as an INGO, Mercy Corps is also stepping up on our own commitment. And the charter that Andrew mentioned earlier, the Climate and Environment Charter, and we're also signatories, and we're looking forward to playing our part. We all have to be part of that solution and be in solidarity, as you've all said. So thanks for listening. Back to you, Ali.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Thank you. Our final intervention from the floor is by the Humanitarian Director at Caritas Europe and Voice Board member, and the speaker is with us in the room, Silvia Sinibaldi. Can we get a microphone to Silvia, please?
So thanks so much. It is quite complicated for me to be the last speaker, as so much has been said up to now, and I have to say that all the points that I wanted to mention were covered, but especially I think that what would be fantastic is if we leave from here with the words of Runa Khan that has joined us here, and the words of Christina from Mozambique. I think that their calls for action should be what should we keep in our minds after leaving this room today. I think that one important thing is related to that is that the NGOs should and the local organizations should always be consulted in the process of policy making, and because they have a wealth of knowledge also on anticipatory action, early warning system, but also resilience. I do think that it is fantastic that we are having this conversation here at the Humanitarian Forum. At the same time, I also appreciate a lot the fact that we have mentioned so many times the need to adopt an holistic and integrated approach to this topic, as otherwise won't be possible to find a sustainable solution. And we all know that is already too late. We know that the many calls about climate remind us that we are really running out of time, and the time to act is now. We welcome strongly the chairing of the European Union for the platform on disaster displacement that will be starting in July. And this is because despite there are different responsibilities and each of the actors should of course still keep their mandate, but at the same time the European Union cannot move away from the policy coherence that it has mainstreamed and that has been recalled for many times. And that's why we are confident that the fact that they are chairing the platform will also make it possible really to adopt such an approach. We would like to underline again, although it has been mentioned already several times, that the internally displaced are those, I mean, the biggest majority of people migrating because of climate are currently internally displaced, 3 or 4 of them. And that among all those are the most vulnerable that are paying the prices of this. We have received testimonies and evidences of the risk also of falling into modern slavery for those that are forced to flee. We do think that displacement becomes a problem when it is a forced displacement, while it has been mentioned many times as well today that migration should be a possibility. That is also why we welcome the fact that IOM was with us today and all the other actors. We do think that the adoption of safe and legal pathways to migrate towards Europe should or elsewhere in the world, in line with the Global Compact on Migration, should be foreseen and boosted. And we welcome strongly the creativity that the European Union is been adopting in responding to the massive crisis in Ukraine these days. We have seen how swiftly the Temporary Protection Directive has been implemented and how fast and in an integrated way its implementation and guidelines have been tackled in these past few days among different units and DGs in the Commission. This shows that if there is a will, there is a way. And that is also why we strongly believe that also when it comes to disaster displacement, such creative approaches should be foreseen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for your comment. Although I wish we had more time to continue speaking, I must conclude this very interesting session. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned from it as much as I have. Let me first of all thank all the speakers, including those on stage as well as those online. I also thank them kindly for their patience with time. Please give them an applause. I thank DG ECHO on behalf of myself and Pro Moderation for the opportunity to moderate. I would also like to thank the tech folks and the interpreters. Let's also give them an applause if that's all right. And last but not least, I thank all of you in the room as well as remotely for your participation. Wishing you the best of luck in your very important work. Till next time, thank you.